This is the Realty Classroom Podcast, episode number 9.
Welcome to the show that focuses on helping real estate agents build a bulletproof business plan so that they can sell more properties in less time and live a more fulfilled life.
Are you a real estate agent with an entrepreneurial spirit who wants to turn your job into a business without sacrificing your lifestyle, but you just can't seem to find the right plan to help you get there? Well, then you're definitely in the right place. Hey, I'm Danny Griffin, the founder of the Realty Classroom and the host of this podcast. And to help you take immediate action to build a better real estate agent business, I've created a free jumpstart course for you over at freeagentgift.com. It'll be good for you if you're a veteran or a rookie. Let's get started today. In this episode, I want to cover confident patience. Now, that's on the tail of the last episode where we talked about the consumer's perception and how difficult it is to overcome that perception. And rather than fight it, let's go with it. Let's embrace it and let's make it part of the process that we deal with. But the first point here today is that you want to avoid an aggressive defense when you're fighting that perception. And what I mean by that is I think back to all the times that I've walked in and I've worked so hard in this formula over almost 19 years at this point, refining it and knowing and being so passionate and wanting to give that information to the consumer so badly only to run into this perception that they have. And worse, when somebody has perception, they get locked into the law of corroboration. Great book, Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, talks about what the law of corroboration is. Meaning, once I make a decision, in this case, based on that perception, I really only look for corroborating evidence to support it. I'm not necessarily in an open-minded space where I'm hearing the agent give me alternatives. So that's a challenge because as soon as we hear that perception and we believe it to be wrong, what do? We go into defense mode. And I mean aggressive defensive mode. And it's almost like we pick a fight with the consumer over that perception. But really, I think what you could do instead is start to think about the difference between your universal process, meaning the one that you know works. In my case, I have 7 steps to home seller success. I have 6 steps to buying success. Those are my universal processes that I follow each and every time when I'm at least educating the consumer about how I will take them through this process. But they have very individual concerns. So as I've said before, in the past, in the way that I've matured in presenting my information, I've become much more patient to understand that they may be very, very hyper-focused on only one of those stages. And I can pretty typically fit somebody's individual focus into that universal process. For example, on the sell side, they might be hyper-focused on marketing. And they believe that all that perception marketing is going to sell their house. And I might get passionate and say, yes, but let's go back and talk about all this other stuff. And you just don't know what you don't know. And that's that defensive mode. Whereas if I will just first recognize that individual concern. Sure, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I understand that you have a marketing concern tonight. And what we'll do is when we get to that part of the universal process, I'll go a little bit deeper and we'll dive into those concerns. But before we even get there, what are those concerns? That way, when I arrive at that moment, I might very well already know a little bit about it so that maybe in these other parts of the process, it really isn't a marketing concern. It actually has a little bit more to do with pricing and how that affects marketing. I don't know. But until I dive into their individual concerns, I don't really know where the emphasis belongs. So again, remember, if I go in at a universal process mode, full speed ahead, and I'm defensive about protecting that, I might miss their individual concern. So it's better to just ask them before we begin the process. In other words, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, what is your biggest concern about this process? Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, what is your biggest concern about buying a property? And you just listen. And that's where I have this little tale I want to tell you. I remember when I was in high school and I had another friend and his name was Danny. Well, it was another Danny. So 2 Dannys. And Danny was a pretty smart guy. And there was one day that we were having a great time. We went over to his house and we were playing baseball in the rain and we were all muddy and we got cleaned up and it was time to get a ride back to school. And it was my father that was actually going to take us there. And so we got into the car and this Danny, your Danny here, I just couldn't stop talking. I just was so excited. It was a great day, and I went on, and I was in that mode that Danny had been in with me, and we just kept going. But I noticed that he was just doing an enormous amount of listening. When my father would ask a question, he'd give a quick and succinct answer to the question, and I just want to go off because I was still in that mode. And I didn't recognize it at the beginning of the conversation that something was just different about him. He was able to shift gears very quickly. He could level up that maturity from the backyard playing baseball to that car with an adult where he was just a mature guy listening. And I have to tell you, I got the message because at the end of it, I was embarrassed, not in front of those two, but myself. Why wasn't I able to shift gears? And I'll never forget that lesson. So now I'm able to do a lot more listening. Even Laura, my inside sales agent, when we went out to a presentation, she said, wow, you do a lot more listening than I ever imagined. And that's because in different contexts, we have to be able to gear up and gear down. But really that mystical listener, that person who's able to ask that question and be comfortable, even if there's an awkward silence. Hey, what's the biggest concern you have? And then say no more. Even if they look at you, gee, I don't know. I've never really thought about it. Maybe you could ask a few more provocative questions, but keep trying to listen because there's something magical and mystical about listening. It's that cathartic moment where finally the consumer breaks and they come forward with what's truly bothering them. And they can get beyond that perception, which usually is nonsense. They've just made a decision, like I said. They've locked into the law of corroboration, and they don't really know why they're so stuck on it until all of a sudden you ask the right questions and you listen. And it's like therapy. They get it off of their chest. And there's no defensive environment. And what's amazing, once somebody's had a chance to really talk, it's almost like they had that feeling that I did. There's a little bit of embarrassment. Whew, geez, I didn't know I was talking so much and I'm a little bit embarrassed. No, don't be. That's what I needed to know so that as I take you through my process, I'm able to focus on what your greatest concern is. And the good news is my process covers that and then some. And then I think the next point is that we have to show them how their focus is part of the process. In other words, they might think it's ridiculous. And I've heard some very light concerns. Well, I just want to make sure that you're going to tell us 24 hours before a showing. Oh, no problem. That's no problem at all. In fact, that's all part of the marketing and then communication process. Once the marketing begins, of course, there'll be requests to show you property, but our communication is impeccable as we can make it. We always give you 24 hours notice or more if you want. You're in control of this whole process. And I think that's the key point here of all of this is we want to empower the consumer. The seller consumer and the buyer consumer need to be empowered by us, not confronted by us, rather empowered. So even though we have disagreements with their perception of how our process works, if we just don't get defensive, we're able to get behind their concerns and lift them up with empowering information, which again, I'll say this many times on this podcast. The more strategic you are going into this conversation, the more confident you are about your strategy, the more easily you'll be able to see how their concern fits into that strategy and explain it to them and show them that it is being dealt with. See, the most important thing about listening is certainly hearing what their concern is. But if there's a part B to that, it's empowering them to know that it will be dealt with, that you heard them. It's one thing to listen, it's another thing to hear, and then it's a third thing to show, my strategy is going to protect us from that really becoming a problem, and here's how. See how that goes? So let's chunk this up again. To summarize the key point here today, we want to learn how to listen and empower the consumer without being defensive. And the way that we do that strategically is number one, avoid an aggressive defense fighting perception. In other words, don't be so defensive. Just listen to what their perception is. Point number two, there's your universal process versus their individual concerns. And point number three is You want to be like that Danny, that mystical listener, the one who really empowered the people by just being a good listener. So that point number 4, you can show them how their focus or their individual concern is actually part of the process that you'll deal with strategically. And then upon all of this, they will feel empowered. And remember, when you empower a consumer with information that's strategic, they will support what they feel that they helped create. See what I'm saying there? By empowering people, they feel like they're part of the process. So they feel like they had creative control over what will happen to them, even though for the most part, what they're empowering themselves in is an already existing universal process. But they will now support it. And that's the key point here. Okay? So learn how to listen and empower the consumer without being defensive. And remember, you can take immediate action to improve your business and get started in the right or better direction with our free video course over at freeagentgift.com. Also, if you like what you've learned here, then we'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and help us share these insights by giving us a positive review on whichever platform you're listening so that other entrepreneurially spirited real estate agents just like you can find their way here to join us so we can build a great community. Thanks for listening. We look forward to helping you in the next episode.
You've been listening to The Realty Classroom with Danny Griffin. Join us next time to continue learning how to build a smarter real estate agent business plan that helps you live a more fulfilled life.